Hope you all can hear me well. And right, so without further ado, we'll start it. So there's two words, composable and inclusive. So the idea was, how do you make something that's supposed to be a tool, supposed to be something that's behind some black box, some black curtain, make it composable and inclusive, right? So composable in the sense, can we make it externally extensible, or can we compose things together like we do functions? Inclusive is about not imposing any opinions on the users, right? So let's go into a bit detail, but before that, I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Rahul. I work for ThoughtWorks as an infrastructure consultant. I go by Lisp clouds on various platforms, and if any of these things interests you on the slide, please come and talk to me. Happy to talk about anything at length, and I get pretty emotional on any of these things. Right? So the idea is, how do we make a CI from the other icons on the screen as well? Right? So how do we inspire something that is monolithic by design, kind of, but take the ideas from Emacs, Clojure, and our Lord and Savior himself, right? So can we break it down? Can we simplify? Can we take the secrets of Lisp and Emacs so that they're still around after so many years, right? Can we make it externally extensible, right? So how many of you like doing CI/CD here? Right? How many of you think CIs are more than black boxes? How many of you have a failed build recently? Yes. How many of you didn't understand why it failed? Yeah. So we have an appreciative crowd here, right? So this is the kind of general idea that we have for a CI. It's a box that we throw things at, and hopefully something comes out. Builds are green, builds are working, and hope that it works, right? So, but why do I call it a black box, right? So why do I call it a core? So the core is what the problem is right now. So we do a lot of things around CIs, but there's too much done at the core itself, the meat of the CI, right? So what is a core? It's the basic functionality that comes along with a CI that you use. Cycle CI, Jenkins, GoCD, Concourse, right? So these are some of the things that the core does, but in my opinion, they shouldn't be doing it. In my opinion, things like orchestration, like being married to a version control system, how to branch, and where to store artifacts, these kind of things should not be part of the batteries included CI that we expect. Right? So hopefully people can agree that. How many of you disagree with some points here? All right, we'll come to hold that question on your head. We'll come to the things here, right? So, right, something like a very specific domain, specific language for builds, right? So the general tendency is we go for tools that does everything, kind of, in CIs, and because it's easy. Things, I want my build done yesterday. I want my delivery happening now. My product manager's after me, right? What is this CI? So how do you explain build time pauses to your product managers, right? So going with easy tools kind of brings its own set of problems. We have a pretty tight coupling with the CI when we go for something that has its own set of plugins along with it. So the traditional notion of plugins is we load the things into the CI, we build it along with the same CI, or load it into the same process, but then what if the plugins has problems? What do you want to upgrade the plugin itself? Can we solve these problems outside the CI core? Right? Plugins often become the bottlenecks of scale as well. If they're written badly, for example, they do the clone pretty slow, right? So the whole CI kind of grinds to a halt because of a wrong plugin, and because it has been loaded into a very fundamental part of the CI, so it shouldn't be there. This is kind of there in a lot of places. We have to use the same technology, be it the language or YAML or things like this, which the CI has been built with. So we don't want to, we can't extend the CI in a way that we want, because we are kind of forced into a contract at the API level, right? So it's either a language or whatever it is, right? And this is my personal problem with every CI right now, is the opinionated UI. How many of you have opened Jenkins on your mobile phone? Does everyone like it? Do you see all the pipelines without scrolling? How many of you open Jenkins on your smartwatch? Right? So these are the things. So UI shouldn't be part of the core, right? So it's something that's your problem, the way you want to solve it. So I don't want to say that bash all the Jenkins, all the CI UIs, but they've been built with certain problems in mind, which may not be your problem. That doesn't solve the way that you want to represent your builds, right? And one thing about the platform teams, you've seen scheduled downtimes emails. We have a scheduled downtime. Please don't deploy anything right now. Why do you have these things, right? Why can't we update things while they're running? Why can't we use the Emacs philosophy everywhere? I don't want to shut down my Emacs, right? So why should the CI shut down? So that brings us to a problem of the opinions of the CIs are flowing along with the artifact itself, right? So we as users in both upstream and downstream are kind of getting affected by it. We need to know how this thing works, right? So there's a very nice talk by someone here who might be familiar to you all, Stuart Holloway. It's called Narcissistic Design. I can really recommend everyone to watch this. People who haven't watched it, this is probably the one single talk that inspired Bob as well. So how do you take the narcissism out of design? How do you not make your problem everyone else's problem, right? See this talk? It's a nice talk in the sense of how what is to be done as how do you make yourself not fireable from your job? That's all this talk is about. So how do you make simple easy, right? We want to simplify these things. We want to break it down so that we can build it up again, right? So in the words of Rich Hickey in his awesome talk, Design, Composition, and Performance, people who haven't watched it again, please go and watch it. Another source of inspiration for Bob. He talks about good design is separating into things that can be composed the way the problem demands it, right? So can we take these things over? So can we see some examples for this? This is Clojure specific, so Linigen is something that we use a lot. Boot, people who are familiar with Boot, it's a bunch of functions that you can compose together, and then you can use normal Clojure code. But stool depths is what from Clojure core, but it only cares about class path building and downloading of dependencies. But you see, each one is more purpose built over the other, and they do lesser and lesser things, but they do it pretty well. So I'm saying, choose more purpose-built tools. You use the Unix philosophy. Use things that allow you to compose externally, right? Some of the examples we can go for, we saw a lot of examples of nice libraries today. Try using libraries, build it together yourself, because probably that might solve your problem in a better way than frameworks. This, I don't think I have to convince anyone here. So we all know what ORMs does, but plain SQL is the thing, so just use it. Data over complex hierarchy, you don't need classes, you don't need fancy things between you and data. Right? And the customary Clojure slide, which every talk needs to have it, and we have it as well. Okay? So, coming to Bob. Who here knows Bob the Builder, the cartoon? Right? So people who don't, it's a cartoon that started in the UK, if I'm not wrong. It's about someone who goes on builds and has an array of machines with them. So each machine does their own thing properly, but Bob is the one that dictates the build. Oh, we do this, we do that, but no one overdoes it. So if you want to find the kid in you, please go watch this again. It's a nice cartoon. Right? So is this one CI to rule them all? So I want to put it as one CI to build them all. Why? Because Bob is a platform. It's a CI platform, right? So how many of you think that we can apply the same thought process as we do with our code to building the CI as well? Like we take all our time choosing, oh, this library we need to use, this function, this variable needs to go somewhere else, right? So how many of us think when choosing the CI, of the same thing. Does anyone does that here? Okay, so I'm saying let's try to do that, right? So why a CI platform? Because Bob is something that you build upon. Bob is something that gives you smaller composable pieces which you can compose the way you want and solve your problem. And you don't have to look at the core. How many of you remember the black box as the core? So we can open up the black box a bit. So to run builds with Bob, you just have to care about these 4 things here. A pipeline, a resource, artifact, and containers. Right? So I hope that they're like basic enough for a build to complete, and I really think that a composition of these things can help you build whatever you want. So remember Emacs and Clojure, compose functions again. Compose externally, right? And how do you compose? So you put your core in the middle, and you can see a bit more details. So everything about Bob is exposing its information model or data model over REST. Why REST? REST is something that a lot of devices can do. Everyone can hopefully implement it in a simple way. And the core idea here is I should be able to compose and tell Bob what to do without touching the core, without loading a plugin into Bob, without dealing with Bob's opinions at places, right? So if you can see in a bit details, it's written completely in Clojure. It runs on the JVM, and it uses this library called CLJ Docker client, which is something that's written by me as well, and it was pulled out of Bob and turns out to be useful to some people here. So go check it out. Okay? So some more facts. It's free and open source, and it only cares about execution. Right? So execution is the core thing that we all should be thinking about. Okay? And this is very, very concurrent, masterless clusters. So one of the things that a lot of CIs use right now is a singular worker node setup, which again poses its own problems. How do you update the master itself? What if the master goes down? How do you scale the master? Right? How do you deal with multiple states on the master? Right? So, and the thing here is, it has no opinions on UIs, build plan languages, or even how to schedule the builds, when to schedule the builds. How do you trigger something? These are the things that should be done externally. Okay? So this is an example of a Docker file. How many of you think that Docker file itself is a build system? Docker is a build system. You can orchestrate builds using just Docker. How many do you think this is a build DSL? Does this look like a pipeline already? And then you can say, from the builder, take this artifact. So that's the idea around Bob as well. So let's just use Docker here, right? So we can pre-provision our builds with Docker. So coming to a pipeline, so it's a list of steps, and a step is a function of resources to artifacts. And that's all a pipeline should ever be. There's nothing else, and if you want some external environment variables, right? So here's an example of Bob's internal data representation. Hopefully it's readable to everyone. It's not something that you write, it's something that you make a post request on Bob with. You say that I want to start with this image, I have this bunch of steps. Each steps can optionally produce an artifact or consume a resource, or a combination of both. So again, going back to the same philosophy of bunch of steps, which has a composition of resources to artifacts, right? And you can declare some resources externally, right? So if you simplify that down further, abusing Docker as a build system, so Bob sits comfortably on top of Docker and completely uses it as a build system. Right? So this is one creative use of Docker that I found. So if you can think of, you start with an image, you take a command, and then you create a container from it, and then you apply the resource to get an artifact. And then you just repeat it. You commit the container to a new image, and then you carry it on, right? Does this pattern sound familiar? What does this look like? Is this a reduce? Right? So that's all pipeline should ever be. A reduce with executes over images. Begin with an image and you reduce over the rest of the steps. That's it. So I don't think pipelines has to be anything more than this. Right? So what is a resource? Resource is an abstraction. So this is one of the fundamental concepts in Bob. So an abstraction over anything that's not part of the core, right? So you have source code, raw files, whatever. And you need to provide it to Bob with a resource provider, right? So it's a web server, again in the cluster, and you can reuse it as many times as you want. So a resource provider on an average view, on a high level looks like this. You take whatever you have, your source control from wherever you hosted it, and you write or use a resource provider. Something that abstracts Bob from knowing what Git is, what sources are, what Docker file is. Bob doesn't need to know what you're consuming. Right? So all you have to do is make this thing and provide a tar to Bob. So Bob is going to make a GET request on that endpoint, and you should get a tar outside, and Bob can continue building. Right? So things like authentication, custom SAML auths for GitHub, private repositories, these are not Bob's concern. Abstract these things in your resource provider, and you can just help Bob along. Right? Artifact is the other side of it. It's the result of a step execution. And the second point is where I'm really opinionated about. Artifacts should not be a part of your core. You should push it out. So how many of you have seen CIs storing the artifacts on the master within themselves? How many of you think that's a bad idea? Okay? So it's like saying I produced a JSON from a Python file and Scala cannot read it. So how do you move your CI? What happens if you want to change your CI? What happens to your artifact? Right? What happens when you run out of disk space? Artifact purge policies. These should be external. Again, nothing to do with builds. Push it out. Right? So if you go on the other side, it's the same thing. So Bob, something that answers get, post, delete on an endpoint, and then you push your things out. Again, specifics of the artifact store can be handled, of the artifact, the real life artifact store can be handled by this system instead of Bob. So if you put it all together, it kind of looks like this. You have resource providers, Bobs, and human and machines who wants to add it. And the thing that you notice here is everyone scales. Everyone should scale independently. No one should be the bottleneck, and then you as the user should also scale. Okay? So a lot of you might be thinking, oh, this means I have to build a lot of things for Bob. Right? So I provide some tooling which you are free to use, but I'm not encouraging just to use them. Right? So coming to the tooling, there's Wendy. I don't know if people get the reference to Wendy here. Yeah. So Wendy was the office manager of Bob, and she's the one who gets the build contracts and tells Bob what to do. Okay? So Wendy is available there. All the things that you do is, so Wendy is the CLI here, and is written in Clojure compiled with Graal VM because CLI, right? And also Wendy orchestrates Bob externally, right? How to do things. So there's resource Git. It's a simple Python 3 server that can handle public GitHub repositories. And artifact local is again a simple Python 3 server which has a S3-like API, and you can store things out of it, and it uses file system. So the takeaway here is you don't have to write in the same technology as Bob was built in. You don't have to write in any particular thing. You just have to do REST calls. Right? So can we build it? So I'm actually gonna do Kubernetes live demos, so help me God. So this is Wendy here, and I have to do it like this, unfortunately. So do we ask Bob, can we build it? Bob says yes we can. Again, a reference to the cartoon. Right, so there is a file here which is Wendy's. If people can see it, so this is an opinion from Wendy, not Bob. So Wendy chooses to implement the builds as TOML, one of the file formats. If you want to have a really nasty discussion about YAML, please find me again. Okay? So how many of you like YAML here? Okay. I'll find you. Right, so this is something that Wendy does. So this is a simple build file which says I have some vars. I want to start with this, and there's some resources which is going to clone Wendy here, and there's some steps. It just says hello, creates a file, and there's a step that produces an artifact there called text, and there's another step that produces a file list by listing all the files in the repository. Right? So it's going to clone something, and it says done at the end. Right? So how many of you think Kubernetes live demos works? Right? So how many of you are familiar with Kubernetes here? Okay, just to give one 10-second thing, Kubernetes is this thing that everyone thinks works, but it doesn't in a lot of places. But it's basically a parent of your containers, and when one of your containers are misbehaving, it just restarts it. That's it. There's nothing fancier in Kubernetes. We should say Kubernetes restarting at scale, right? So there's some pods running. So there's two Bobs here, one DB and one resource and an artifact here, right? So that's all you have to care about it. So let's try to make Wendy do things. So pipeline create. So that's how you create a pipeline. You say create this thing with the tunnel, and then you say start here. Start, it says okay, and then we'll try to get some logs. Right, so you see this has pulled some images, it has load some artifact, it's pretty fast, and it has produced two artifacts here, file list and text. So let's see if the artifacts came in. So let's try to get the text one. And let's try to get the other one here. So you can see these are all REST calls that are happening, and just produce two files. So cat test. You see, one was from the environment, and the other one was a normal echo. Right? And files. So this is the listing of the files from the repository. Right? So it's hopefully simple enough. Okay, Kubernetes worked, holy shit. So I think we can build it, right? So why do we just stop at CI/CD? Can we go beyond that? So hopefully people agree that this is a very generic workflow orchestration engine. You can pretty much do whatever, because you can do whatever externally. You can tell Bob what to do. You can customize it to whatever. So continuous delivery for pipelines, that's something that ThoughtWorks is also pushing. That's where I work at, and we should be doing more and more continuous delivery wherever. So it's not just code, but anything can be done. Data processing, schedule batch jobs, basically just execute. That's all there is, right? So some other projects in the same spirit. So Concourse CI, which is a place where Bob got its resource ideas from, and a lot of places where it is very, very similarly decoupled to Bob, but then again, you have an opinionated UI, you have an opinionated branching control, you have opinionated artifact flows. But if you're okay with the opinions and you want something that's production ready, you can use Concourse CI. The Unix design philosophy, tools depths, AWS API is this library from Cognitect, which very simply wraps the AWS API, and you get a very data-oriented control. You can do things on your own. You can orchestrate externally, right? And Emacs, because Emacs, right? So I want to conclude by saying that this thing from Albert Einstein, which I think really applies here, really applies to the whole domain of infrastructure in general. And we should be striving to make these things available everywhere, not just our code, not just our day-to-day things, but make things simple, but always try to find the line beyond which you shouldn't be making things even more simpler. So with simplicity comes responsibility as well. So to sum it up, that's what I had, and thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Rahul. So we have copious amount of time for questions. So, are there any questions?
Hey, I suppose if I was to create a new product or something like that, and I was looking for a CI solution, one of the things that I would be looking for is how quickly can I set it up in sort of a usable way. That it's it has the basic integrations, has a basic UI, that sort of just to get started, just to get my my project built. Have you got all the wrappers around that?
Yeah. So as part of Bob's deployment, there is a Docker compose file available with all the stuff built into it. You just have to say compose up, and you get your resource provider, you get your artifact stores, you get everything out there. And UI is something that I personally am not good at. I'm writing, but there's some people who are trying to contribute to this. So UI is in the making, hopefully, but there's Docker available and there's a Kubernetes manifest available as well. So you can just apply these things and you should be good to go for basic builds.
Okay, thank you very much.
Right.
Hey, thank you for your talk. I hope I have some simple question.
Sure.
So why you've decided REST API is a way to expose and not something else? Because maybe there are some more flexible approach here.
Right. So I went with REST because I wanted to put it out on the network. One of the reasons being extensibility should not be happening on the same process, the same heap. So I don't want to be affected by the problems of the other tooling, right? So REST came to me as the most used ubiquitous frameworks out there, or standards there to talk to things. Or I could have gone with more data-oriented thing, but again, that would mean co-location of the other tool into my machine as well. So I want to be in my own machine. I want to be talking over the network. So REST seems to be the most lowest common denominator. But I'm open to other ideas, other things. Yeah.
What's the footprint of Bob? Like you mentioned, you have a Docker Compose file. Could you just sort of spin this up on a $10 a month virtual machine? Or what's
I have done like basic memory profiling things. So it seems to be good with idling. That seems to be what CIs do a lot. But the bigger footprint that happens is in the image download. That's where probably I could footprint image of Bob itself. If you publish Bob as Docker, which is available in Docker Hub as well, but you can see it's pretty fat. So disk space is something that is concerning right now, but I don't see RAM footprint as such a big thing. But if you decide to scale up, then you might see some things.
Hello. So if you store your source code in Git on GitHub, for example, how do you trigger Bob? Do you have something that accepts webhooks, or do you use post-commit hooks with Wendy, or?
Yeah, so that's something that you should be doing externally. Like either use a third tool that orchestrates both the resource provider and Bob, or you can write a resource provider that can trigger Bob as soon as. So think of Bob as the very basic execution engine, and you should always be building on top of it. So that's the idea there. So webhooks is again kind of implementation specific, so I don't want to put that into Bob's core.
How is resource Git different from GitHub API?
Yeah, so it's a simple Python server which answers to this endpoint called Bob resource. So whenever Bob sees that you need a resource on a step, it's going to go look for a resource provider, and it'll make this request. And what resource Git does is clone the repository and give a tar back to Bob, so that it can move along. So it could be anything. Bob doesn't have to care if it came from Git or Maven or whatever. So that's the.
Any more questions?
So, are you familiar with Lambda CD, which was
Yes.
presented here a couple of years? How would that? Is there any way to make that fit? Because it
Yeah.
doesn't seem like it would be a resource provider, right?
Yeah, so Lambda CD, full disclosure, has been written by one of my colleagues from ThoughtWorks. And it's, the thing is, it's written in Clojure again. And if you want to write builds as Clojure code, that's something that you go for. But that has the problems that I said. Like, it will do the git clone itself. It has a UI.
Okay.
And your team needs to know Clojure to use it.
Okay.
So-
So there's not really a way to make those two fit.
It could be. I mean, that's the thing. So I try to pull this thing out even more than even having these opinions as well.
Okay.
So, but you can use Lambda CD as one of the orchestrators externally as well. So Bob can go use that anyway. So there's plans of making Bob available as a library as well, but I'm not too sure on that.
Okay.
But yeah, that's it.
Thanks.
That looks about it. I see no more hands. So thank you very much, Rahul.
Thank you.